Hello, I'm Grace McClintock, the Assistant Vice Provost for Academic Personnel here at UCSC. We're going to talk today about the process of retirement and becoming an emeritus professor for Senate faculty. I'm joined by Professor Brenneis, Professor Emeritus Brenneis, who is our Pathways to Retirement faculty liaison and has experienced the process firsthand. So we'll talk about the dates that are best for retirement. And this is an important thing to know for Senate faculty because your pay is not spread out over the 9 months that you work. And it's a little bit more complicated, and there will be impacts to your pay if you don't choose the right retirement date. And we'll talk about what emeritus status is, what it means, what are the benefits and privileges that come along with that. And we'll talk about recall appointments, which is when you return to work after retirement, and why you would get a recall appointment and what the benefits are of the recall appointment as opposed to just an emeritus title. And then we'll talk about the Pathways to Retirement program. So there are two dates that you should be aware of, and they're not exactly the same thing. So a separation date is the last day that you are a regular paid employee of the university. The separation date is also the same as your resignation date. So that's the last day that you are working. And in this example, and a very common date is the last day of your employment, or separation date is June 27th. Your retirement date is the first day that you are a retiree. So it might be the day after your separation date, or there might be a little bit of a gap in between those two dates. Your retirement date is when you become eligible to receive retirement income, and those payments, just like employee payroll payments, happen at the end of the month. So if your retirement date is July 1st, then you start receiving pension payments on August 1st for the July period. A UCRP inactive member is the person in between those two dates. So if you have been an employee, you vested in retirement, and then separated from employment, but have not yet started your retirement officially, then you're considered an inactive member of the UC retirement plan. And that's very important because at the end of each June, folks who are inactive UCRP members receive a cost of living adjustment on the retirement income. So normally UCRP provides that the salary rate for retirement income is based on HAPC, or highest average plan compensation. For those of us in the 1976 retirement tier and who are inactive members of UCRP, at the end of each June, that HAPC is increased by the cost of living adjustment. The COLA is tied to the consumer price index, so it's a little bit different each year. But you only have to be inactive on the last day of June in order to receive that COLA. And so we normally suggest, recommend that folks choose one day prior to the end of June for their separation date, so that you are technically inactive on the last day of June, and then your retirement date begins 7/1. So this only applies to those end of June retirements, but you won't be paid for the day or business days that you are inactive, but it's still worth it for the long-term income of having that COLA. So it is possible to retire anytime during the year, but not all dates are created equal. And I'm going to strongly encourage you to consider retiring at the end of June, and I'm going to tell you why. When you're selecting your retirement date, there's, of course, many factors that come into that decision. What's happening in your department with its curriculum, with your students or lab members, or your own team, and what the situation is there. You might have had discussions with your dean or chair about plans for your retirement and how that's going to impact the department. And it's sort of long-term planning. One thing to know is that if you have been on sabbatical leave, you're subject to the requirement to return to service, active service, following sabbatical for a period equal to the time that you were on sabbatical. So if you took a year of sabbatical, you have to return to service for a year before you can retire. You can retire, I should say, but you would be required to repay the salary that you received for sabbatical if you don't fulfill that return to service obligation. So plan ahead for that. don't expect to be able to use sabbatical as your last year of service prior to retirement. The time to retire is 30 to submit your application for retirement, I should say, to the Retirement Administration Service Center, or RASC, is between 30 and 90 days in advance of your retirement date. So they don't even allow you to submit a request for resignation sooner than 90 days. I don't have the exact days, but they are posted. And if you submit with less than 30 days of notice, then there's a very good chance that your pension payments won't start in time to provide continuity of income throughout that time. So that's the window, the good window. Finally, once you have selected a resignation or retirement date and that application has been accepted by the RASC, then you should still provide a written letter of resignation to your chair and dean. That can be an email these days, that's fine. But you should know that your retirement application is confidential and RASC does not inform the campus of your pending retirement. Even when it's completed, they don't tell us. And so the only way that we know to stop your pay and in the payroll system is your resignation email. So, resigning for the purpose of retirement. Written resignation is binding, and so be sure and don't do it until your application has been confirmed by RASC. If you know who the academic HR person is in your division, please copy them on that email. That saves the dean from having to forward it to the right person. All right, let's talk dates. So most faculty are paid on an academic year calendar, which means that you work for 9 months of every year, from the beginning of fall to the end of spring quarter, following the academic calendar. But your pay for that 9 months is spread out over 12 equal paychecks so that everybody's got consistent income and benefits coverage. So this table here shows the service periods and the associated paychecks. So for fall quarter, for example, the quarter begins at the end of September every year, different day depending on the academic calendar, and it goes through sometime in mid-December. And however, the fiscal year for the university starts July 1 and goes through the following June 30. And so the first 4 paychecks of the fiscal year are compensation for the work that you perform in the fall quarter. So that's July 1st through October 31st. It's the first 4 months of the fiscal year. You're paid at the end of the month, like I said. So it's the paychecks August, September, October, and November. Those are payment for services rendered in the fall academic quarter. And so you're prepaid essentially for that quarter. If you retired at the end of fall quarter, your separation date then would be October 31st, technically for payroll purposes, meaning your last paycheck would be that payday, November 1st. Your retirement date would be November 1st, and then your first retirement check would be 1 month later on December 1st. So obviously that is well before the quarter's even over, and so you would be expected to continue being in service and working through the end of the actual fall quarter. So same thing for winter and spring quarters. They start to get closer and closer to the actual dates of service as you get further along in the year. But most faculty choose to retire at the end of a quarter. And so these are the dates that you're going to pick depending on which quarter. Mid-quarter retirements are very challenging, and I hope that RASC advises you not to do that. So if you can't pick June 30, try to pick the end of a quarter, but it would be the end of the pay quarter, not the academic quarter. Right. If you plan to retire at the end of fall and you don't apply for that until the end of fall, then it is possible that you could have already received too much pay. So winter quarter pay starts November 1st. And if you don't tell anybody that you're planning to retire at the end of fall until December, then you will have already been prepaid for winter and you would have to reimburse that pay. Similarly, we sometimes hear that people decide sort of late that they're going to retire over the summer, and they announce a retirement date of, say, September 1st, right? Which you would think is appropriate because that's before the beginning of the next academic year. However, because fall quarter pay begins July 1st, you would have already received pay for July and August, which is prepayment for fall quarter. And if you retire and don't work in fall quarter, then again, you'd be expected to repay the university for those months. So again, the best time to retire when the fiscal year and academic year pay lines up is June 30. And that also makes you eligible for that inactive COLA. So is there any questions about that before I move on to the next section? Okay. Feel free to put them in the chat. Okay. Emeritus is a title suffix, meaning, distinguished. It is added to the title that you had prior to retirement. And the conferral of that title is meant to be honorary, and it happens automatically for associate and full professors at the university. The policy underlying this is the Regents 1203 and the Academic Personnel Manual 120. And it, again, is conferred automatically. You don't have to do anything to request it. It will stay as a title in the payroll system. And so you'll have sort of a 0% or without salary payroll appointment, and you'll still show as an active employee in our system. And so when you go to the parking office or the library, anywhere that where it matters what your employment status is, it'll still show you as active rather than separated. Now, it's only automatic for full and associate professors. The assistant professor rank, very uncommon that people would retire from that rank, but not impossible. You only have to be employed for 5 years to vest, and assistant professors can be any age. For assistant professors, and also for the whole teaching professor series, a conferral is not automatic, and it requires the process of review that goes through the academic senate. The department and dean do a nomination, the senate reviews, and the chancellor makes the final determination. Our campus, both administration and senate, have pushed for a change in policy to make conferral automatic for teaching professors, but that has not happened yet. For academic administrators, it's the same process for conferral. It's not automatic, and that would be necessary in order to use the title Dean Emeritus, for example. If somebody retires, they have to be the dean when they retire, so it's the title at retirement that matters. And it goes through this approval process. It's not, that doesn't impact the conferral of emeritus suffix on the professor title, which every dean has underlying. For other administrators, the chancellor, vice chancellor, any that are in the senior management group, so-called, requires even more thorough review in order just to use that title. So it has to go up to the president's office for approval. They have to have been in the position for 5 or more years and demonstrate evidence of meritorious contributions to the fulfillment of the mission and programs of the university. And then there's a even yet more rigorous process for applying for emeritus status for non-Senate academic employees. This is fairly uncommon, but not unheard of. It often happens for long-time librarians, adjunct professors, continuing lecturers, if they have 10 years or more of university service, and they've attained the highest rank in their title series, which is, not all of the non-Senate series have the same 3 ranks that the latter ranks do. So it kind of depends on the title there. But if those criteria are met, the department and dean can recommend, the Senate will review, and the chancellor can approve conferral of emeritus status, a non-Senate academic appointee. That is not available. So it also is necessary that the time between the separation from the university and the retirement is 120 days or less. So people that resign from the university after having vested and then go work somewhere else for 10 years and then retires from the UC retirement program is not eligible for emeritus status. So there can be a small gap, but really it's meant for people who are retiring directly from UC. In order to revoke the title or to prevent conferral automatically, that's considered a disciplinary action. And so it's subject to the same policies on faculty discipline that apply to non-retired faculty under the Academic Personnel Manual. The curtailment of emeritus status is the only other disciplinary sanction besides termination that requires approval by the UC Regents. And finally, the most recent update of the APM took up the question of whether there could be a gender neutral option other than Professor Emeritus and Professor Emerita, which are, gendered in Latin. And so that was debated, and the policy currently suggests just using the abbreviation EMER as a gender neutral option. I've seen people use Emeritex, but in policy, emeritus status is conferred regardless of the type of retirement. So that means you can elect the monthly retirement income pension plan or the lump sum cash out. And now that there's a savings choice option, the definition of retirement for those folks is that they have reached normal retirement age and have 5 or more years of university service. Then they're considered retired for the purpose of the conferral of the title. Oh, and I skipped the bullet about those who separate from service as a disabled UCRP member. So if you retire early and receive disability income from UCRP, then the title suffix is also available.
Question.
Yeah.
Is it appropriate to use Distinguished Professor Emeritus as a title? I know the distinguished is sort of informal, right? But I've seen some people using that.
But there's a campus memo that discusses the use of the working title Distinguished Professor for those who have attained above scale status.
But with Emeritus, would it be the same?
So yeah, I think if somebody attained above scale and then retired, the Distinguished Professor Emeritus would be. Okay, so I have a bunch of slides about emeritus privileges. The first and arguably the one that people are most interested in is about the physical space. So the campus statement is that they provide office, lab, and/or studio space when it's available to emeriti who need it to continue scholarly and creative work. And that's the goal, but in reality, many buildings and divisions, as you all know, are very impacted on space. And so it's often not available. If you hope to have space assigned to you after retirement, then that is definitely a discussion you should have prior to retirement with your dean to find out the feasibility. And that is something that Dawn works on in the context of a Pathways agreement. And we'll talk a little more about that later. If you have office space in the department, then of course that comes usually with a mailbox for physical mail. And benefits office, correct me if this has changed since we did this presentation last, but my understanding is that all retirees, staff, and faculty may apply and receive a complimentary A parking permit or an annual Metro Pass, one or the other, so long as you're not recalled to active service. And you have to have worked at least 2 years at UCSC, but if you get a paid recall appointment, then you're no longer eligible for the retiree parking pass, and you have to start paying for parking again.
Yes, it still is a benefit, Grace. Thanks.
And so if you need and want that, give it at least 2 weeks to allow processing time at parking. That's what they said. I would recommend more if you can. But you can't give it to anybody else. It's not transferable, and you have to give it back if you no longer qualify. So email is something that you will retain just through the virtue of having the emeritus title, because remember how I said it doesn't terminate your employment record in the payroll system, and that's going to keep automatically feeding your cruise ID, to the email Google systems, and so you'll retain access indefinitely to your email and any other Google related program. And then, however, if you have gotten used to using your UCSC email for your personal business, many of us have, because it's easier to just have one account, and we've been doing that for a long time. I would strongly encourage you to stop doing that at retirement. Use that opportunity to bifurcate your personal and professional email. And that is because if you pass away and your survivor needs access to your email for any reason, they're going to have a really hard time getting that from the university. It's not impossible, but it's a real hassle, and sometimes not possible for legal reasons. What about your computer? Can you keep your computer that was university issued? And if so, can you submit an IT ticket? Can you purchase software? That's a common question, and it depends a little bit on your division and department's policies. Don can probably speak to that as well, but that's a common need, and it's something that I've seen supported in pathways agreements. And the OPERS facility recreation center is available to everybody, including retirees. You get a discounted facility membership, though, if you want to keep using OPERS. Nothing changes for library access. You'll still show up in the library system as an active employee, and my understanding is that nothing about your borrowing privileges changes at that point. The Academic Senate has bylaws about status of emeriti, and that's not my specific area, but I want to call attention to bylaw 55D. That states that emeriti members of the Senate retain membership in the departments to which they belonged at the time of retirement. They do not have the right to vote on departmental matters except as provided in bylaw 55D. And then I haven't pasted the whole text of that, but essentially that section goes on to differentiate between matters that impact the campus divisional senate versus matters that only are relevant to your department. And it does not allow for voting rights on personnel actions. So emeriti typically voting rights on non-personnel matters within the department, I believe, but questions should be directed to the Senate about voting rights post-retirement. Generally, emeriti are considered active Senate members. They are invited to Senate meetings, receive all of the agendas, continue to participate in shared governance, including by serving on committee on emeriti relations and attending the general meetings. We get asked a lot about PI status. Many faculty at retirement have ongoing grants or have plans to submit new proposals after retirement and continue to focus on research or take their research in a new direction. The emeriti faculty are eligible to submit proposals. That's a huge benefit for those folks continuing to have that title. Now, if that grant is funded, then in order to be a principal investigator, once the grant has arrived at Santa Cruz, then you need a recall appointment, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But no exception is necessary to submit those proposals.
Hey, Grace, can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
For the PI status, the recall appointment, is that still the case even if you're not drawing salary off a grant in which you're listed as a PI?
Yes, it is. And yeah, I'll talk about why in a couple of slides. These are all links, and so if you got copies of the slides, and I think you did, these are links to various retiree associations. We have the Campus Retiree Association, Retiree and Emeriti Center. That's the actual office. The Emeriti Association, which is just for the faculty. The Emeriti Association is part of a council of system-wide Emeriti associations. And likewise, there's a council for the Retiree Association, which is both faculty and staff. And then, as I mentioned, there's Senate Committee on Emeriti Relations. And all of these groups, I suppose, offer for events, opportunities to stay engaged in the campus, for community service and volunteer work. They manage the KUCRA manages a travel agency, but travel planning and discount programs, and the reduced fee enrollment program if you want to take classes, UC classes in your retirement, and then opportunities to participate on committees. You might miss committee work as a retiree, and there are plenty of committees that would love to have emeriti serve. Okay, stop again for questions before I talk more about like a return to active service for a specified term appointment with a start and end date post-retirement. Recall appointments may be offered for teaching or research activities or service or some combination of those three. The recall appointments can be compensated or uncompensated, and it's not always necessary, but sometimes it is. So just by being in an emeritus title, you're welcome to mentor students, serve on committees, such as dissertation committees, perform service, other kinds of advisory committees. All of that, if it's unpaid, you don't need a recall appointment to do. You don't need one to be on campus, to be doing your own research, etc. Anytime you're going to receive compensation, though, recall appointment is required. So the common scenarios for that are either the department needs you to teach a class and they're going to pay you for that, or you've received a research grant and you'd like to use your grant funding to pay salary for the research work that you're doing. Anytime, other than receiving compensation, there are 3 cases that a recall appointment is required. I mentioned being a PI on a grant, and that is because there are expectations of PIs, obligations to the university, that makes it important for us to be able to track that you are active rather than, more active than other emeriti. If you need to supervise an employee, especially a represented employee, and most of our academic employees are represented, that comes along with responsibilities that also warrant having a recall appointment, whether you're paid or not. And the third one is serving as an instructor of record for the same reason. So if the university needs you to take a mandatory compliance training, for example, or there's performance issue or disciplinary issue with your employee, or there's an emergency and we need to know who's in the building or who is currently working in the particular area, then having that recall appointment gives the university a way to distinguish between the emeriti who are really still active and engaged on campus and those who are not necessarily. Many people retire and move away and keep the emeritus title, but have no real engagement physically on the campus anymore. During the COVID years was a challenge for us to enforce the vaccination policy, because the policy required us to collect information from folks who were on campus and who had active appointments. And emeriti show us having active appointments, but many of them were not anywhere near UCSC and had no reason to provide that information. And so it was sort of a manual process of contacting each one of them to find out if they are going to be on campus or not. That's an example of a reason that it's good for the university to know if you are still engaged. If you don't meet any of those 3 or 4 criteria for the cases where a recall appointment is required, then maybe it's not worth the paperwork. You will be added to those lists for the mandatory compliance trainings. You'll get a lot more email, that sort of thing. Appointments are typically for a year, occasionally just 1 quarter, but maximum of 3 years. And there's no limit on the number of reappointments. Renewable indefinitely. They can be tied to a grant period if it's for that purpose. It is an appointment in the sense that it goes through an academic personnel review. I think there's been some confusion about that. It's a very abridged review, but there needs to be a department letter with a department recommendation. There may or may not be a vote required depending on the department's bylaws. And that review file gets created in Div Data, flows to the dean, and it's the dean's authority to approve a recall appointment. And as I mentioned, it gets you on the list for mandatory trainings.
Grace, if you know that you're going to be retiring and you will need this, like I'm already a PI on things that will continue, does it make sense to just try to start that process right when you tell your department that you're retiring?
Normally, yes, but with the possible wrinkle that starting this year, there's going to be some additional changes for folks who get recalled sooner than 6 months after their retirement date, which we are going to talk about in a moment.
Okay.
But if after that you decide to do the recall appointment right away, then yes, start that ideally in the spring before the faculty leave for the summer.
And from what you said, if I'm PI on a grant, I would have to do that, right? Okay.
Yes. Wonder if, well, that might be an offline conversation since we're recording.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And I would have the same question, actually.
Yeah, let's talk about, after we get to that slide, we can have the discussion and then just can edit it out if you are expecting a paid recall appointment, and especially if you're relying on that as part of your post-retirement income, then make sure that you are discussing that with your chair and dean before you retire, because it's not automatic or it's not guaranteed. It's very routine, I would say, but just make sure that you have that conversation. The administration cannot may only make a pre-retirement recall agreement. So they can't even offer you that position unless you are age 60 or older with 5 years of service credit, which most faculty retirees are. If you're going to be paid in your recall appointment, there is a 30-day waiting period. That has long been the case. That's not new. There's a kind of a rule that if you're still receiving active employee income, then you can't also be receiving pension income, and our two systems do talk to each other and validate that. That's why it's important to let us know that you've retired so that the pay can be terminated in the payroll system. But if you retire and then start getting paid again right away, the same thing's going to happen. The retirement system will see that you're an active employee, and that will choke. So there's still a 30-day window before receiving a paid recall appointment. Also, permanently after retirement, there's a cap of 43% of your monthly salary rate at the time of retirement. That rate is adjusted each time there's a general range adjustment on the faculty scales. So that salary at the time of retirement will be range adjusted sort of behind the scenes in order to determine what the cap is. So 43% of that is the maximum that you can receive in any given month from a paid recall appointment without triggering some very undesirable Medicare consequences. There's also UC policy, so it can't be done. And then, of course, if that pay is coming from a research grant, then that grant's going to expect that your effort is also 43% matching the pay. If the agency requires that, all of them do. Okay, so research or recall titles. There's also, I think, a lot of confusion in this area. There are 4 official payroll titles for recalled academics. They are listed here. You would think that those are not mutually exclusive titles, and you'd be right. There's one for those who are teaching only, Senate or non-Senate. Recall faculty is for Senate faculty doing teaching and other things, research and service. And there's one for just teaching and not being Senate, so a lecturer or adjunct who's recalled just to teach. And then a recall title for non-faculty academics, such as librarians and researchers. So that's what your payroll stub is going to say, and the title that you'll be in the UC Path system. You may recall, till about 5 years ago, we had a recall title called research professor, which was super helpful if you want to apply for grants, because you don't have to use the title emeritus, which shows the agency that you are retired. And a lot of people want to not call attention to that necessarily. And it's also seen as a more accurate sort of representation of what somebody's doing if they're being recalled just to do research. The payroll title would be recall faculty. And so what happened was the title policy was rescinded at the system-wide level. It wasn't a campus decision. And since it's no longer an option, we have said that it is fine to use it as a working title anytime you have any of these recall appointments, if it's appropriate. Working titles are mostly not enforced. My position is that you can use any working title that you want that's not another real title, for one, and that is sort of reasonable and not objectionable. I don't know, use common sense. People want to ask for the use of the research professor title as part of the Pathways Agreement, which is a little bit unnecessary, because the use of the working title is at your discretion as long as you have a research appointment. So what you're really asking for is to have a recall appointment, not to be able to use that title. 43% time ensures that you do not become eligible for UCRP again as an active employee. So people who work less than 43% time never reach the threshold to become UCRP members. If in rare cases, it is possible to work more than 43% time if you unretire. Unretire means stop receiving your pension and then return to work at full time. So that occasionally happens, mostly for administrators. So somebody's retired and a couple of years later returns as a full-time, acting dean or ABC did that. So it is possible, but you have to apply for it and you have to have chosen the pension rather than the lump sum. And there's some other rules. In a recall appointment at any percent time, you contribute 7.5% to the defined contribution safe harbor plan in place of a social security tax. And you then normally take that as a distribution when your appointment ends. Okay. This is my almost last slide where I talk about the changes going into effect on July 1st of this year about recall appointment timing. So, and I'm going to ask my benefits office colleagues to help me out with this one because it gets pretty in the weeds. So if under the Affordable Care Act, benefits eligibility is based on the hours that you worked in the measurement period of 12 months, every 12 months. So there's a measurement period that goes from November to October, and that determines how many hours worked in that period, determines your benefits eligibility for the following calendar year. So in the past, once somebody has retired, we have held that, you're in retiree medical benefits forever after that, not employee health benefits. However, the newest policy holds that if, because of that measurement, you become eligible for employee benefits, then you have to be offered employee health benefits, and that supersedes your retiree health benefits. And so because of how the measurement period works, there's a period of sort of the first 6 months after retirement. If you have a recall appointment in that time, then it's very likely that you're going to exceed that threshold and be offered employee health benefits for that next year. And then what the level that's offered is the mid-level employee benefits, which includes health insurance, but not dental and vision. So you would be in retiree dental and vision, but employee health. And then once that recall appointment ends, then you would have to switch. You would be offered and able to, but you would have to go through the process of switching back to retiree medical. And that's for yourself, your dependents so it is possible, but it's kind of a lot of red tape and it could be disruptive to your healthcare, to your prescription coverage, etc. And so we are telling everybody, if you can wait 6 months, then please do. If you cannot wait 6 months, then you should get specific individual counseling on your situation. Now, I also understand that this could be a problem even if your recall appointment is unpaid. Because if you don't have any recall appointment, you're not even measured. They're not even going to look at your hours. Once you have any recall appointment, then you become measured and eligible for possible employee benefits. And so depending on your retirement date, that could happen even if your recall is unpaid. So I'm going to ask Mary Ann if you want to correct anything and then take questions.
I don't know if you can see my face, I've been nodding along with you. So you did very well there. And this is a new policy that becomes effective at the beginning of the next fiscal year, next academic year. So July 1, 2025. So any recall appointment on or after that date will be evaluated in terms of this change in policy. And the change in policy is in compliance with Federal Affordable Care Act requirements, as well as Medicare secondary payer requirements. But the policy change will apply universally, regardless of Medicare eligibility for anybody involved. And so I'll just stop there and ask if there are questions that I can help clarify.
And I'm also planning to talk with John McMillan, VCR, about whether we want to reconsider the requirement that PIs have recall WAS appointments, at least temporarily, for the first 6 months. Would it be satisfactory to the agencies and, for the university's risk to have perhaps somebody else designated, or, that just the emeritus appointment perhaps would suffice for the PI temporarily.
That's an interesting approach as well. Thanks for letting me know that.
But if you are planning to get pay, then there would be no way around it
Yes.
on this one.
Yeah, I really look forward to getting all of the technical questions, which are, they're assembling FAQs on this. And so there will be more deeper, broader, expansive communications coming out in the next few months. But did want to let this group know, because you're the first graduating class, if you will, that could be potentially affected by this if you were to retire this year.
Probably already have, but they are now offering weekly office hours, one-on-one counseling. My understanding is after some years of some challenges, that service has become much more accessible, and hope that is your experience, and I'd like to hear from you if not, because we've been working hard, all of us on this call, to sort of lobby for better customer service experience and more timely pay and better service from RASC. And I think they've really headed in the right direction. And now I will take these slides down so that we can see
the lower half of your faces, which is what's coming across on the screen. And I'm really thankful as someone who's involved in continuing to talk to faculty who are contemplating retirement, to have such a clear presentation. It's incredibly complicated turf, particularly the last slide, which actually I wanted to start out with a quick question: to whom should people turn for that one-on-one advice?
You can send people to me if they have questions about that. I'll be the point of contact for the campus on this issue.
You were always so generous and so knowledgeable. Thanks. I'll be calling you soon. No.
Oh, good to hear.
Let me just say a few things, because Pathways is still relatively new innovation in terms of retirement. The goal, I don't know the genesis of it, because Herbie's hand came down and asked me to do it. But my sense is that the program was set up to try to accommodate something like phased retirement. In terms of the system-wide, there isn't a phased retirement program, but the Pathways is meant to give people the opportunity to, in working with their chairs and secondarily with their deans, to specify what they'd like their last year of teaching to be like, and what they would see in the couple of years after the point of retirement as particular benefits or options they could have. And many of the benefits that and I've talked to probably about 65 folks over the past few years that I've been doing this. In theory, the program is really best pursued if folks start out a couple of years out before retirement, because then you could get more ducks in line in terms of what your final year might be like. But in reality, I would say that probably 2/3 of the folks who've talked with me are retiring in the same year that they're putting into the program. One of the crucial thing in the process is to put together a letter, which is essentially the basis of a contract between the faculty member, his or her dean, and his or her department chair. And a lot of that contract is fairly boilerplate, essentially saying, here's when I'm retiring, here's when I'm separating, and that I'm agreeing to these dates irrevocably. That is, I'm saying, yes, this is when it's going to happen, when I'm going to leave. And then there's the crucial thing is there's a section for examples of what you would specifically want to request from your department or division to help make your last year and the ensuing years more productive and more engaged for you. So this can include, some of the things included here are what Grace already walked us through in terms of standard emeritus benefits. Clearly, it's interesting everybody wants an office if it's possible, but there's been less demand for lab space than I would have anticipated, and more demand for studio space. And different divisions have different resources for doing this. But one thing you could ask your chair to do is to make it possible for you, if it's feasible in terms of resources, to continue to work in your office for a couple of years or whatever. And in PBS, until recently, at least, I'm not sure what the current situation is, Paul Koch was very good at putting together essentially matchmaking for people to share lab space, which was working out to their satisfaction. But you can essentially get a guarantee. If the resource is available, you can get a guarantee for it. Anyone can apply for the research professor title. That's become much easier in recent years. It's particularly useful as a funding address, but it also gives you, it's not age indicative. It doesn't, as Grace says, it doesn't tip people's hand that you're already emerited. One of the things that, and anyone can apply for recall, one of the things you could negotiate with under the Pathways program that you could negotiate with the chair is the guarantee that you would be offered a recall position, teaching or whatever nature. It's mostly, I've seen people requesting teaching, sometimes asking for one course a year for a certain number of years, sometimes pointing to specific courses they want to be recalled to teach, which often build on what they've been developing in the last few years of their fully active teaching. Everything here, all the resources to support the program come out of department budgets, with a little help from the division. So there's not much consistency across the departments in terms of what they have available, but it's worth asking. The sense I've had, and when you fill that out, when you fill out basically the form letter and then put in your request, you should meet with your department chair and work through it. You could also send me a copy to take a look at to see if there are things I might suggest in terms of the pros or whatever. And then your department chair can sign it if he or she agrees with it, and then they have to take it to the divisional office for the dean to sign off on it. And then it gets submitted to APO for sort of vetting as to form and to make sure everything is actually proper and feasible. So it's a fairly straightforward process. The main reason for getting involved in it as a faculty member would be that you want a certain degree of certainty about what you're going to be doing your last year. One benefit you can ask for is not a course relief, but a modification of duties, which means that you can essentially get something equivalent to a course relief where we're allowed to grant them for finishing up a research project, working with your potential successor and teaching the classes that you've been teaching, get an application in for further research proposal, and begin to pack your books, which is one of the chief sources of anxiety among retiring faculty anywhere. So modification of duties is fairly important. The key thing about the contract is it's a guarantee both for the faculty member and for the institution. Part of the goal is to make it helpful for departments in terms of planning, who's going to be gone when, and when should we be able to put together a request for a position that affords us the same kind of benefit that faculty member had. And it gives the faculty member a sense of what he or she can count on from the institution. And that's really pretty much it. The process is, if folks are interested in it and want to discuss it further, if they want to discuss the technical side of it, you've already met Mary Ann and Grace, who actually know an infinite amount more than I do. I sometimes think I was chosen for this position as the least common denominator in terms of being totally ignorant, having gone into the retirement process, and I would not be here today without them. But I'm certainly not a bad starting point, and I can know a lot of people to point you to for more information. There are a number of entries on the website, if you look under Pathways to Retirement, which include the sample letter and discussions of both pre-retirement and post-retirement benefits that often people argue for. And take a look at that, give me a call. I'm always happy to be on the end of a Zoom call, at least no more than 4 hours a day. And I found it a consistent pleasure to talk to faculty who are contemplating this. My one regret is that I meet many really interesting faculty who I never knew because they're in other departments, the other end of the academic world or the other end of the forest. But if you want to talk about it, the other thing is it's in total confidence, which makes record keeping a little challenging. And nobody has ever evinced any terror of their chair knowing about it. But when the program was set up, the idea was that this was to be outside the formal process for people who were trying to explore what the possibilities might be. And that's pretty much it. Any questions folks have? Maureen, I know, is at least a veteran of this process a while back. Anybody have any questions? I'm happy to answer them now or online. Good again to see you all.
The genesis of the program was Herbie in large part, and it was a program that had been piloted at UCLA that we'd heard good things about. And so our program was modeled on a successful program there. The goal was not to incentivize retirement, but to make it a smoother process for everybody. And deans like it because it gives them an idea of when to expect that FTE to be freed up, and it helps the long-term planning. And I've heard just all good things about it. And as Don mentioned, having the neutral third party and having that person be a faculty member who really understands what your needs are.
I'll just follow up on Grace's point there. Five of the campuses have someone in a position like mine. The actual duties of that person and the degree of expertise varies a great deal. Any of the campuses that have med schools attached have a much more complicated world to look at, particularly in terms of moving back and forth across statuses and the like. In some places like David Lopez is about to retire at UCLA, but he really developed the prototype program and has been a really very effective advocate for system-wide programs along these lines. I spent some time last week talking with someone from the Academic Senate at Santa Barbara, where they're considering putting an office like this, and there seems to be a fair amount of interest and support. One of the things that we can do is articulate with CUSEA, with the system-wide committee on Emeriti relations, and also be involved, particularly back a couple of years ago, when, as Grace very delicately suggested, there were problems at RASC. We found ourselves corporately, the five of us, as being ongoing interlocutors with RASC and folks who they were talking with, providing data to. And as a footnote, our sense is that seems to be working considerably better now. And certainly, I don't know what Mary Ann's experience is, but far fewer calls by people who are desperate about when their health insurance is going to actually happen.
Yes, we don't desire the return to the dark days of 2020 when it was very difficult. And I am also bound by confidentiality rules, and I'm prohibited from sharing any individual's retirement plans right up until the point they sign their retirement election form. So I want you to feel welcome to reach out to me if you have questions. And I'll put my contact information in the chat should anybody want to follow up with me, and it will be a confidential conversation that we have if you need any. And I have a note to follow up with Maureen and Don individually directly regarding the question that we discussed earlier.
Anyone watching the video in the same situation should also reach out.
Yeah, and so just to let you all know, I will be providing a survey after today's presentation to you, an email, and also a summary regarding today's presentation and the recording, which will, of course, have parts of it, edited out, but that will be provided to you after today's presentation. Any other questions?